As you know, a sequence is a short melodic and harmonic passage that is repeated at a different pitch level. The most common type of sequence is the circle of fifths sequence. In the circle of fifths sequence, each chord has a root a fifth below or a fourth above the previous chord. Here we have a circle of fifths progression in G minor. The first chord is a G minor triad, followed by C minor, followed by F major, etc. Note that the chords follow the key signature. From this E flat major chord to this A diminished chord, we have the interval of a diminished fifth between the two roots. A few things to note about the circle of fifths sequence. The sequential module, that is, the passage that gets transposed, is 2 chords long. The module is therefore transposed down by a step in its sequential repetitions. Even though the sequence is called the circle of fifths sequence, nothing is literally transposed by a fifth. It would be silly to put Roman numerals on all of these chords. This would be simply going through the mechanical motions of popping chord labels on a piece of music, but would entirely miss the point. In a sequence, there are 2 important chords: the chord on which the sequence begins and the chord on which it ends. Everything in between is a byproduct of the sequence and doesn't participate in functional harmonic progression. This is an important difference between sequences and other chord progressions. So we'll label the first and last chord with Roman numerals and put a line in between indicating the sequence type. In this case, we'll write COF for circle of fifths. Since the literal chord progression is less important in a sequence, the outer voice counterpoint is the main thing that's going on. Most of the time, a sequence will give rise to an alternation of 2 intervals between bass and soprano. For example, in the sequence written here, we have fifths alternating with tenths. This alternation is called a linear intervallic pattern, and here we say that this sequence gives us a 5-10 linear intervallic pattern. Even when we have a more complex musical texture, we can generally reduce any sequence to a simple linear intervallic pattern. For example, this passage from Handel's Passacaglia reduces to the same 5-10 linear intervallic pattern we've been looking at. This video will introduce 2 other common types of sequence in addition to the circle of fifths sequence. The first is known as the descending third sequence, or more commonly, the Pachelbel sequence, because it is the sequence that underlies the famous Pachelbel canon. The classic version of this sequence involves a stepwise descent in the bass, alternating root position and first inversion triads. The literal chord progression you'll get is 1, 5, 6, 6, 3, 6, 4, 1, 6, etc. But as you know, this rote chord labeling misses the point. We'll write 1 at the beginning and 1, 6 at the end, labeling everything in between as the Pachelbel sequence. We will want to make sure to indicate with figured bass symbols every inverted chord, even though these chords won't get Roman numerals. So every other chord here will get a 6. There are several possible soprano lines that go with this sequence, but a particularly common one gives rise to the linear intervallic pattern 10-6. On your handout, you have an excerpt from Beethoven's Piano Sonata Opus 79 and Bach's Gavotte from his 5th French Suite. Though these pieces sound quite different, they actually contain the same linear intervallic pattern within the same Pachelbel sequence, in the same key no less. Here's what the Beethoven sounds like. The first three measures contain three sequential modules, with each successive measure a transposition of the previous down by third. The reduction of this sequence is relatively automatic. B, D, G, B, E, G in the soprano, with the stepwise descent in the bass, followed by a quick, imperfect, authentic cadence. The Bach piece sounds like this. When we reduce the outer voices of this excerpt, we see the same counterpoint, but with the soprano's first note up an octave. Bach's sequence ends after 5 chords rather than 6, so the last chord of the sequence is 4, leading to the IAC. A variant of the Pachelbel sequence contains all root position chords. So, rather than a stepwise bass, we get a fourth down followed by a step up. This is in fact what occurs in Pachelbel's canon. Rather than making you listen to that piece, let's take a look at a Chopin mazurka. Here we have the literal chord progression 1, 5, 6, 3, 4, 1, all in root position. We'll write the first and last 1 chords and indicate that in between we have a Pachelbel sequence. Notice that in reduction, the soprano line has the stepwise descent that normally would be in the bass. The final sequence type we'll be talking about is called the ascending 5-6 sequence. This sequence is a clever way to transpose a module up by step while avoiding bad parallels. The beginning of each module is a root position triad. If we just had this, we'd have bad parallel fifths. To avoid this, the fifth moves up to the sixth halfway through the first chord, resulting in 2 chords per bass note. The result is a staggered stepwise ascent in the outer voices. A striking example of this sequence comes from Edvard Grieg's famous Peer Gynt suite. At the climactic moment of the first movement, representing a sunrise, the main melody is subjected to an ascending 5-6 sequence. For 2½ measures, we have a 1 chord with sol on top. This sol moves up to la at the end of measure 3, representing the 5-6 shift, and then the bass moves up to re, giving us a 2 chord. In the 7th measure, the 5-6 motion speeds up, and the sequential module is 1 measure long. Here's a reduction of this passage. The sequence begins on a 1 chord and ends on a 2-6 chord. From this 2-6 chord, we actually modulate to a new key, the key of C sharp minor. You'll learn about how to modulate like this next week. Sequences are a special kind of progression. Many voice-leading rules do not apply in sequences. Given that each chord within a sequence follows the voice leading and doublings of the model, you will often encounter dissonant leaps, doubled leading tones, and diminished triads in root position. The power of the sequential repetition overrides the usual rules of doubling. Now that you've internalized the three main sequence types, it is a good time to complete the first page of your homework assignment.